Behind the tradition of trust,
As a small child, it destroys your soul.
the Boy Scouts of America kept a secret for
If
decades.
convicted of all charges, Woodall could get up to 165 years in prison, and Ciale could get 60.
Spong says women's brave testimony became critical to prosecute the Scout leaders. While women practiced his best Knievel feat in front of his house on Dimmicourt Street near Jesuit High School, a Boy Scout troop leader stopped by to talk with his mom.
I didn't know it then, but what they would do is go through the neighborhoods and identify single moms and ingratiate themselves, and then we'll take care of the kids. He's going to be in the Boy Scouts.
Unbeknownst to women and his mother, that new Boy Scout troop was formed for another reason, a dark reason.
There's monsters here in human form. They abuse their trust. Swallow us whole, then regurgitate ashes to feed their lust. Monsters say they love us, but monsters don't know how.
In the 1970s, Photomat was in the photography business. They were located in tiny huts situated in shopping plaza parking lots that were staffed by usually just one employee. Photomats promised speedy photo processing. On August 23, 1976, Assistant Scoutmaster Harry Kramer brought in a roll of film to Photomat in Dallas, Texas. He needed to get on develop. The worker who developed the film roll discovered disturbing pictures of men having sex with young boys. He took the photos to the police. These photos were traced back to Harry Kramer, who they discovered lived in New Orleans. Harry Kramer at the time was only 21 years old. Harry was an assistant scoutmaster of Troop 137, a Boy Scout group in New Orleans. This find led police to the home of head scoutmaster Richard Halverson, who happened to be the other man in these pictures. Richard's home was raided by police on September 10th. The police found 2 foster children living in Richard's home, boys ages 9 and 11. They were all taken into custody, alongside Richard for possession of the date drug called Tuinal. Tuinal is a heavy sedative usually used before surgery. Also another Boy Scout leader named Robert Lang. There among the Scoutmaster's handbooks, they found magazines with such titles as Naked Boyhood, Young Boys, and Boys for Sale. They also found hundreds of pictures of new boys and boys being. Also, police found hundreds of index cards. These cards had addresses of boys in all different states. Also, they had their sexual preferences down and personality types. Richard Halverson had filing cabinets full of documents and letter correspondence with men in other states as well. Detectives stated the material had been used to facilitate the interstate trafficking of boys through mailing lists and advertisements placed in magazines. Harry Kramer was arrested after he tried to flee the country to avoid charges. Richard Halverson was also arrested, but this was just the beginning of what they would discover about this child sex ring that began when pedos decided to form Boy Scout Troop 137. This Boy Scout ring would eventually be linked back to North Fox Island, not one but 2 serial killers who tortured boys. Could this Boy Scout ring also tie back to the New Orleans rope murders? You may never heard about the rope murders. It is a strange case. Hello, my name is Holly. Welcome to the Murder She Shed, the place we discuss rarely heard true crime right from my she shed. Just make sure and help this nerdy Southern girl out by pushing the subscribe button. And hey, I just heard that I have a hype button. I think what you have to do to hit that is where the subscribe button is. You just scroll over and there's my hype button. Also, one more thing before you start. If you're a faithful watcher of mine, you may know I already have a video about North Fox Island. If you haven't watched that video, I will link it in the comments below because it does connect to this case. And there's so many more things that connect to this case that I couldn't even get through it all. I only got through a small portion of this huge, huge rabbit hole. Massive, biggest rabbit hole I've ever gotten into. The whole purpose of this huge international ring was to use boys and sell them for money. Richard Halverson and his friend Raymond Woodall previously worked at a private children's school in Florida called Adelphi Academy, owned by a wealthy individual named Peter Bradford. This alternative school operated as a front for men who wanted to buy young boys. After Richard and his bud Raymond moved to New Orleans in the early 1970s, they decided to start Boy Scout Troop 137. It was never started to be a normal Boy Scout group, ever. It was started for the most sickening reason. This group was started so predators were able to get easier access to boys in order to abuse and profit off of these innocent souls. While Richard Halverson was the front man, the one in the business suit and tie who would go out and make the deals, Raymond Woodall was the evil, devious one who actually manipulated the victims. He was the guy that was shady, very shady. But Raymond, although evil, was a mother's boy. And he actually still lived with his mother. And he would bring the victims into his mother's home to abuse them. They actually had an 8-year-old living in their home. Apparently, this 8-year-old's mother didn't have much money and she already had 7 children. And she just let Randall keep this child. I suppose she didn't know, actually, that he was a predator. In order to start Troop 137, the troop leaders would target boys from poor backgrounds, often by infiltrating organizations such as Child Welfare Services and Big Brothers Big Sisters of America. They would prey on boys that were poor and from broken family homes like single mothers. The boys were usually between 8 to 12 years old. Richard and Raymond had even become juvenile probation officers so they could access cases of files of juveniles that had been in trouble. And sometimes they would reactivate those cases. They would then tell these boys that they had reactivated their cases, that they either had a choice to go to this school and they give them a full scholarship for the academy in Florida, or they would be in trouble. So, of course, the parents are going to pick this school. After sending them to the alternative school, they could then receive profit from Peter Bradford, who sold the boys to creepy men and also made the boys pose and do acts for pictures and videos. The boys were not allowed phone calls or given any contact to their families while attending this academy. This is just a side note that I was going to add in here. It made me think of those schools where kids are kidnapped and put on those farms where they say your child's not well behaved. We'll take them to this school. We'll straighten them out. I mean, Paris Hilton was in one of these schools. They won't let the children have any contact with their family after they start attending these schools. It reminded me of basically the same kind of operation. And that's scary to think about, that a pedophile ring operated in the same way as these schools that we still have nowadays. And I'm with Paris Hilton. I don't think these schools should exist. They're scary for someone else to have full control of your child. That's just my opinion and just a side note. Harry Kramer, Robert Lang, and Louis Seal was also scoutmasters in this troop, and they would help lure boys in. To help lure boys in, they would offer them gifts such as motorcycles or guitars, or even just paying for their Boy Scout outfits, which was a lot to a single mom. And to keep her boys busy while she probably worked all the time, this really helped her as a single mom. So I'm sure she thought, Boy Scouts would be so good for my son. The sad part about it is they took advantage of these single women that were trying to take care of their children on their own and did this to their children. It's just awful. John Campbell was another artist who ran an art studio. He was also a photographer. John would place ads in the local newspapers asking for Huck Finn and Tom Sawyer-like boys to pose for fishing photos. During these photo shoots, the boys would be introduced to Troop 137 and told how much they could have fun going camping and to pool parties. I'm sure the boys didn't know they were talking about naked pool parties. Also found John Campbell's artwork. He passed a few years ago, but he was actually pretty famous with his artwork and had lots of painting. And one of these paintings was of a boy fishing, oddly enough. And who knows, it could have been one of the boys that he abused. John Campbell would later have all charges dropped against him. And that's a long story in itself, because his district attorney, Harry Connick Sr., yes, he's kin to the actor Harry Connick, it's his dad, was having an affair, allegedly, with Campbell. And so, because of that, his charges were basically just dropped. Before Troop 137 was arrested, they had applied for federal and state funding to start group boys' homes in order to get additional access to young boys and, of course, free money from the government. The predators would take a group of about 10 boys on camping trips and essay them. They even injured one boy so badly that he was hospitalized. Now tell me, how do they take this boy to the hospital with those kind of injuries and questions not be asked about what they were doing on this camping trip? I don't know, but they got away with it. One of the victims of Troop 137 was Eddie Wells, who would later end up as an unsolved murder. We're going to discuss him later in this video, along with a few other murders called the Rope Murders. Randall Woodall and Robert Lang also had a tour guide service called Adelphi Tours. This tour guide service was an escort service in which boys were pimped out to rich men all over the U.S. Customers of the service allegedly included at least 2 U.S. congressmen, a U.S. senator, and politicians from around the country, and also a Protestant clergyman from Texas. When Richard and Randall homes were raided, they found evidence that this Boy Scout troop was actually connected to a boys' farm in Tennessee and also to North Fox Island. Officers found a letter sent to Richard by Claudius Vermilye, personally inviting him to visit Father Bud's boy farm in Tennessee. This was the same farm in which Gerald Richards had donated lots of money to, and Gerald Richards is connected with the North Fox Island scandal. Claudius Vermilye, or Bud as he had the boys call him, was a priest who ran a 1.5-acre boys farm in Tennessee. He was supposedly helping these boys in need, but instead he was preying on them. The boys were shown obscene movies to arouse them and given liquor, so they'd be kind of sedated, and then basically a ditty party was thrown. That's all I'm going to say about that. Just call it a ditty party. They were then allegedly filmed by hidden cameras. Some of the pictures were sold to active sponsors to raise money for the farm, and some of these sponsors allegedly came to the farm to be on these videos and to do things to the boys. Although he was a priest, Boys Farm was not church-sponsored and was funded largely by its clientele, who were pedos from all over the U.S. In one letter, Claudius wrote, "You will need months to rest up after group experiences with boys at the home." The photographs were developed in a darkroom located in his attic and were mailed to customers. He was also essaying these boys who were from 11 to 16 himself, along with all these other men. He also had his own son, William, with him at the farm, whom he would abuse too. When his son was 22, William went missing after he got in a dispute with his father. Imagine that. William's body was never found, but his wallet and car were found on a mountain road near the boys' farm property. During the raid, the most concerning information of all was found inside of Randall Woodall's address book. Officers found John David Norman's name and contact information. This ties Troop 137 to one of the most notorious and scandalous names yet. If you don't know who this is, well, you're about to, and you may not want to. This guy has been linked to not to one serial killer, but 2 serial killers. And although not proven, was said to have made films. John Norman is known for all his alleged links to serial killer Dean Corll and John Wayne Gacy. All these monsters may have not had internet to find each other, but yet they were still able to connect with these other monsters like themselves somehow. If they had links back then, before the internet existed, can you imagine what goes on now with so much technology available? What kind of rings could exist now? It is almost mind-boggling. I was very shocked to learn that John David Norman was born pretty close to where I live. Not nothing to be proud of. He was born in Ada, Oklahoma, and I definitely know why Ada doesn't brag about this link. I wouldn't either. Strangely, I think I may have found an article about Norman being a Boy Scout in the Ada Evening News. I'm not actually sure if this is him, so I'm not going to say it is or it isn't. I mean, if anybody else has that information, let me know if this is actually him as a Boy Scout, which is disturbing. I don't know, somehow extra disturbing that he was linked to the Boy Scouts and he was a Boy Scout. However, I cannot find the name of Norman's father linked anywhere besides this article, so Like I said, I can't verify if this is the right John Norman, although the date of his birth in 1927 would put him about the right age for this clipping in 1939. Said he was awarded first prize for best all-around camper and stated his parents should feel the highest satisfaction in him being their son. He grew up and became a monster, and I'm sure that they no longer claim him as their son. Well, they're probably dead, but I don't know, and I wouldn't claim him at all. Ugh. I would disown him, actually. On August 14, 1973, Dallas police acted on tip, raided the residence of John David Norman, 45-year-old suspected pedophile. Upon his arrest, authorities realized he was living with 5 teenage boys. In the house, they found child abuse paraphernalia, cameras, magazines, and catalogs seemingly used to traffic and film boys and young adult men for his company called the Honesty Foundation. The material referred to them as fellows and listed their age, names, personalities, and interests in a folder marked Epic International. Is that just coincidental that same thing happened with the Boy Scout group when they were raided? They had their stuff cataloged too. Age, names, personalities, all that cataloged too. In a folder marked Epic International, not only the names of the victims were found, but also, kind of disturbing, bottles of urine were found with the name of the victims on the bottles of who the urine belonged to. Why? I don't know if he had this kink that he liked to keep children's urine. I don't know. Just thought that was really strange because this was before DNA. And I don't know why he wanted it for that reason, but I don't know. Maybe he sold this urine to other predators. Maybe they might like that sort of kink. I'm not sure. The police found enough stationery, equipment, and documents pertaining to Norman's trafficking operation to fill a whole pickup truck. Among the scene, they also found a stack of index cards containing 5,000 names and addresses of people across the country, some of them belonging to federal employees. During this raid, 4 pictures of boys had the word kill across them. This greatly concerned the police because during this time, boys from Houston were mysteriously disappearing. Over the years, the victims were collectively given the group name of the Lost Boys. They ranged in age from 13 to 20, and many of them vanished while going about their daily routines, walking to work, or trying to use the payphone. Just a few days before the raid on Norman's home, they had found a serial killer who had murdered at least 28 of these boys. It was the Candyman, Dean Corll. Both of Dean Corll's accomplices said he claimed to work for an organization based in Dallas that bought and sold boys. Could Corll have found the boys that he murdered with the help of John David Norman? Houston police also discovered a private post office box Dean Corll was thought to have used to secretly receive porn through the mail. Norman was never charged for supplying any boys to Corll, mainly because it could not be proven. However, investigators did find Odyssey Foundation material in Dean Corll's home after he was killed. After the raid, the State Department from Washington confiscated from Norman the 30,000 index cards listing clients from around the country, some of them prominent people and some federal employees in Washington. 2 of the names found on the index card had matched those of State Department employees. This may not surprise you that the State Department destroyed every single card. When the FBI came to request these cards, they were told that the cards were destroyed due to something called passport irregularities. After Norman's arrest, an anonymous man from California paid his $35,000 bond. Norman headed for Illinois with a new name and a past client who provided him with an apartment. Norman continued his trafficking business known as the Odyssey Foundation. In 1973, he was arrested again 3 months later when a local boy named Kenneth Hellstrom told police he had gone there with a man who had offered him beers, and the man then had performed OS on him. This time there was $325,000 bond. This didn't stop Norman, however, because he still ran the Odyssey Foundation from behind bars. He had changed the name to the Delta Project by that time, and a young assistant named Philip Paskey he met in jail helped him continue this business. You won't believe how they were able to continue this business. The 2 men were allowed to use the jail printing facilities to print out their newsletters called Harmies. To help Philip, Norman would mail out pictures and info about the boys he had for sale to the sponsors. At least that's what Norman called these pedos. The sponsor would pick out a fellow, which was code for boy, from the magazine, and then the boy was flown to wherever the sponsor was. And they kept the boy for as long as they'd like for a certain amount of money. Philip Paskey was a cross-dressing young man who had a penchant for violence and raping boys. After Philip and Norman were released from prison, they moved into the same apartment together in Chicago. Philip was still working for Norman, but he also got a side job at PDM Contractors working in construction. You won't believe who the owner of that company was, or maybe you will. The owner of the company was a man who was known to hire good-looking teenage boys. His name was John Wayne Gacy, the clown, the other serial killer that Norman had ties to. Here are the pay slips Philip received from Gacy. Norman and Philip's apartment was only about 20 minutes from Gacy's home, where all 33 boys' bodies were found in the crawl space under his house. They lived that close. Gacy hunted on the same grounds that Norman and Philip hunted on for victims.
There's monsters here in human form. They abuse their trust. Swallow us whole, then regurgitate ashes to feed their lust.
In a 1992 interview, John Wayne Gacy attempted to implicate Philip Paskey and John David Norman. He also claimed Norman and the Delta Project men were producing snuff films of young boys, which possibly included some of his victims. At least two of his victims, Kenneth Parker and Michael Marino, had last been seen alive close to where John David Norman and Philip Paskey lived.
Here we've got a Philip Paskey who had a newsletter going out of the Cook County Jail. And here he is involved with a guy named John Norman. And John Norman was running Boys for Hire. They were making films with young boys. To me, they were pimping them off. They were selling them. There was a crossover when we checked into John Norman's background that he goes all the way back to the early 70s, involved in. He ran the Norman Foundation. He run Epic International and the Odyssey Foundation out of Dallas, Texas. And these were organizations where wealthy men could hire young boys for sexual weekends.
Had you ever met Norman? You ever had any contact with Norman?
I have yet to see a current picture of him, and therefore I'd had to say no. Phil Paskey may have been with him at one time or another because, see, again, I came home from out of town at times, and Phil Paskey would be at the house drinking beer or something like that.
Gacy even said Philip had his keys, the keys to his house and the keys to his car, and he would use them when he was out of town. Actually, he said he gave several boys the keys to his house and car, and claims that they were doing killing while he was out of town, and kind of tries to blame it on Norman. John David Norman never stayed in prison long. He was arrested 19 times, but he was released very quickly. When he was released, he would change his name. He ended up using around 20 different aliases to avoid being arrested each time. Also, each time he is arrested, his victim and clients list would mysteriously disappear. Clients list would disappear. Victims list would disappear. That doesn't sound familiar at all. He was eventually arrested for the last time in August 1987 in Illinois and spent the rest of his life in state custody. He died in 2011 at age 83. Okay, a new pedo is going to be dropped in this story. This pedo was connected to Boy Scout Troop 137 and is often talked about when the New Orleans rope murders are discussed. And as we know, Boy Scout 137 was connected to John Norman. And so that's why I added John Norman into this story. Because it's like I said, when you go down one rabbit hole, you have to conclude another. And at some point, I had to quit. This pedo, Stanley Burkhart, is still bouncing in and out of jail to this very day. We're also going to bring into this story a survivor of Boy Scout Troop 137, Richard Winman. Richard was a Boy Scout in Troop 137 from 72 to 76. His troop leaders were the predators whose house were raided: Tom Woodall, Louis Seal, Richard Halverson, and Harry Kramer. And he admits that he was abused by all of these men. Richard explained that they would take the boys out to eat, buy them presents, take them camping, and let them stay over at their houses. He also sold them to other predators who would travel from all over the U.S. and Western Europe in order to stay with the boys in hotel rooms located in the French quarters. Some of the boys would even get flown to wherever the chicken hawk, as they were called back then, was located. And sometimes the pedo would pay to take these boys on holidays. Just shows you that these boys were not being sold to poor or middle class, but to rich men who could afford to fly them all over the world. The kind of men that are powerful enough to make a client list disappear. After the predators were arrested, Richard had to testify in court against these pedos. Our predator Stanley Burkhart worked as a police officer in New Orleans from 1972 until 1987 in the rape, child abuse, and pedo units. 12-year-old Richard was introduced to Stanley Burkhart when the detective needed someone to look after the boy while he testified in court against the troop. Instead of protecting this young boy, he began to abuse Richard too. The first time this happened, Stanley took Richard to the NOPD's evidence room, showed him child porno, then essayed him. He continued raping Richard for several years. At some point, Stanley started taking Richard to pedo parties in the French quarters and would use him as bait to make cases against other predators, but only the predators he didn't like. I guess there were certain ones, maybe the rich ones, that he liked. When Richard got tired of this and started to push back against the officer, Stanley showed him a picture of a badly decomposed body of a boy who was later identified as Eddie Wells. Remember I said we were going to discuss the death of Eddie Wells later in the video? Well, this is it. According to Richard, Stanley would threaten him with that picture, saying that if he refused to do what Stanley told him to do, he would end up like Eddie Dirt. This is Eddie Wells' nickname. Stanley was actually one of the officers who was investigating Eddie's death. Stanley knew all the predators in New Orleans and was very well acquainted with the Boy Scout leaders that Richard was testifying against. One time, Stanley even told Richard that he had killed Eddie. Richard conceded the possibility that this was just an empty boast, but he said he was frightened anyway. Eddie Wells came from a single mom home with two brothers. His father had died when he was 10 years old. Eddie Wells and his brother were in Boy Scout Troop 137. Imagine that. Eddie had started getting abused by the men in this troop at a young age. So he had a hard life at a young age. His father had died, and then he was supposed to look up to these men in this Boy Scout group, and they took advantage of Eddie. By the time Eddie was 13, he was described as a hustler and was making up to $600 weekly in the French quarters. That's according to a local newspaper. I would never call a victim a hustler. But back then, a lot of these young boys were called hustlers. Eddie did get addicted to drugs, but it might have been just because he'd been through so much. That happens when you've been traumatized so much. I mean, I was abused as a child, and I also got addicted to drugs. Sometimes that goes hand in hand. Edward Wells, known as Eddie Dirt or Little Eddie, was 17 in the summer of 1982 when Harbor police fished his corpse from the currents of the Mississippi River. It was estimated that the boy had been dead for 4 days, and by that point he had already started to decompose. There was no evidence of skull fracture, shot wounds, stab wounds, or suffocation. The coroner put his cause of death as accidental drowning. There was one officer who insisted that his death was no accident, but a murder, he said. And that person will surprise you. It was Stanley Burkhart that said this was a murder, and he didn't like the coroner had wrote accident. Stanley pointed out Eddie's missing wallet and the list of predators that he had kept in his wallet. It makes me wonder how Stanley knew about the list in this little boy's wallet. That's kind of fishy in itself. Did anybody ask that question? How do you know he had a list? I bet if the list was, they looked at the list, I bet Stanley's name would have been on it. He also said that Eddie's mother received a call shortly after Eddie had disappeared in which an anonymous male informed her, "You'll never see your son alive again." Stanley knew Eddie when he was hustling because he had actually go pick him up in his police car and bring him back to his mom. At the time of Eddie's death, No one knew that Stanley was a predator except for Richard and his other victims. One other victim was Vic Groomer. When Vic was 8 years old, Stanley moved into the same John apartment complex that his parents actually managed. Vic and Stanley's nephews would play together inside Stanley's apartment. One day when he went over to play with the nephews, they were not there, and that is when the essay began.
Stanley Burkhart was one of the police officers that lived in the building. I believe they were paid or had reduced rent to work a detail. I think there was about 10 of them that did that. He'd have his nephews there, so it was kind of okay to go run in to the apartment. That friendship thing went on for months, like kind of taking me in as just another kid, and then eventually his nephews wouldn't be there. He would point what at you and click, and pull the trigger. He'd point the himself.
Vic said that Stanley had known Eddie because he said Stanley would describe him as the boy he was going to save. He said Stanley would also take Eddie to football games. After Eddie's death, Vic would say that Stanley would also threaten him with the same picture of Eddie's decomposing body. 5 years after Eddie's death, a startling secret emerged. The one-time head of the police department's pedo unit was hounding predators on the streets while amassing child at home. In 1987, Stanley pleaded guilty to 5 counts of trafficking and child. He would later say in federal court that one of the aspects of his job that he found attractive was that it gave him access to this kind of material. He faced a maximum of 50 years in prison, but was sentenced to only 10, and he ended up serving little more than 5 years. On his release in 1992, he pleaded guilty to molesting his 9-year-old niece a decade earlier, crime to which he had confessed while undergoing therapy in prison. He was sentenced to time served and found work as a truck driver and stagehand, among other jobs. He would later admit to molesting a second niece as well as a nephew. In 1998, Stanley again pleaded guilty to child charges after he accepted a video from a postal inspector in a sting operation, prompting officers to search his home. They found a 12-year-old boy inside. In 2006, Stanley violated the terms of his release and accessed while staying in a halfway house. In 2011, a federal judge declared him sexually dangerous and committed him to a federal prison treatment center in North Carolina. He was released in 2015, but violated his parole again in 2019 by using a secret cell phone and unauthorized accounts to download and comment online about hundreds of images of young boys. And he purportedly communicated with email addresses containing the prefixes boys 6 to 12, lovely young PP. I don't even want to know. The U.S. Probation Office then granted Stanley supervised release on an ankle monitor. He's just been arrested again. Yes, in July of 2025, after prosecutors alleged he violated parole conditions by secretly using cell phones and the internet to access social media and comment on photos of children under screen names like Boys for Me. Just like Norman, Stanley was released from prison numerous times and did not pay fully for his crimes. Remember how we talked about the niece whom Stanley molested? Her name is Kristen, and she lived with Stanley and his wife, who was her aunt for a short period of time due to family issues. Kristen said that her brother was friends with Eddie Wells, and that Stanley was always abusing her brother and Eddie. The day that Eddie was murdered, her brother told her that he was in the car with Stanley and Eddie when an argument broke out, and she believed the fight was about exposing Stanley for what he had been doing to boys. During the fight, Kristen's brother jumped out of the car and ran, and after this, her brother never saw Eddie again. After Eddie's body was found, Stanley showed Kristen and her brother a picture of Eddie's body. She felt like he was threatening them not to talk about what he had been doing to the kids. Kristen's brother would later say from an interview that was done while in jail that he was showed the picture that everybody else had seen. And in that picture, he actually saw a rope around Eddie's neck. That has never been mentioned before, and he's the only one mentioned that there was also a rope around his neck, like in the rope murders. Stanley had a huge collection of Elvis Presley records. He was a big Elvis Presley fan. And Christian claimed that inside the covers of these records that he kept child, and some of that child, it involved Eddie on them and her brother to be seen in these pictures. Stanley, he was arrested. The police actually collected all these records. I mean, why was that not investigated then? That he had a picture of dead boy in his collection. Never a question asked about it. This brings us now to the rope murders. These murders involve the victims being bound by rope just like Gacy and Coral's victims. The rope murders involved 3 teenage boys who lived in the French Quarters in the 70s. It was alleged that they were hustlers, as it called them back then, in the same area as Edward Wales. Edward Wales' murder actually happened 4 years later. These murders happened earlier than when Eddie was killed, or his death happened. All 3 teens in the rope murders have been tied up and strangled. Their hands, feet, and neck bound with a rope or cord that would tighten the more they fought to free themselves, eventually strangling them to death. So the more they would move, the tighter it would become around their neck. That just makes me panic just thinking about that. Oh my God, I can't even imagine how terrifying that must have been. You know, whoever killed them sat and watched as they panicked. All 3 of these boys shared slight builds and similar hairstyles, and they even worked at the same place in the French Quarter. That was Jimmy's Coney Island hot dog stand. Strangely, victim Richard Winman had worked at this same Coney stand as a busboy when he was 13 years old, right around the time he was introduced to Stanley Burkhart. What a weird coincidence that this area is the same place that Norman and Gacy hunted for their victims, too. A couple of police that worked with Stanley have said he was an expert at rope tying and would sometimes demonstrate that with other officers. He was very skillful at that kind of thing and would brag about it. Sounds familiar. I think Gacy did too.
They said, well, what kind of a knot do you use? I said, what do you mean knot? When I tie things up? I says, depending on what I'm using it for, I said, the only thing I ever learned from Boy Scouts is a tourniquet knot.
Boy Scouts is a tourniquet knot.
He said, well, show us what that is. So I took, at that time, and again, it's together, but in order to demonstrate it here, I took the rosary and I said, well, here, you put it around. It's hard trying to do this. Why don't you put your hand out? Okay, here. What I told him, I said, here, all you do is you wrap it around, you put 1 knot in it. And I said, then you put a 2nd knot in it. Okay? Mm-hmm. I said, then you take a stick and stick it in here and you just turn this. And I said, it causes a tourniquet. I said, that's the only knot I ever learned.
Precisely the kind of knot found on the ropes wrapped around the necks of the victims found under the house on Summerdale.
The 3 rope murders occurred less than 2 years apart, and their bodies were found just out of New Orleans. One of these boys was Dennis Turcotte, who attended the same school and church as Eddie Wells. Dennis was 19 when his body was found February 3rd, 1978. The body of 17-year-old Raymond Richardson was found a month later. The next boy body was found a few months later by deer hunters on November 12, 1979. It was not identified, however, until 2000, when they decided to dig his body up and test the DNA. Just so happened his brother had an arrest record, and I guess his DNA was on file, so they were able to figure out who this boy was. Strangely, this victim, Dennis Dewey, had an X tattooed on his left hand between his thumb and index finger. This was often done as a sign of ownership by a child sex ring located in Colorado in the 70s. This case is mind-blowing. It has one weird link after another. That's what I'm telling you. It leads you back to the same thing over and over. On Turcotte's murder, the investigator described the crime scene as gross incompetence, if not corruption. He said the rope the boy had been tied up with was thrown away. The money in Turcotte's wallet was taken out, and the victim had on oversized tennis shoes, which were also thrown away. Investigators said these oversized shoes would have been really important because they could have had some kind of ritualistic symbolism. And I was like, what in the world is he talking about? How do oversized shoes have ritualistic symbolism? Which, kind of find out after I finish listening to this podcast, I'm going to tell you the name of the podcast when I get done, where you can go on the biggest rabbit hole you want to. Before I finished listening to it, I realized he meant something else. But by that time, I'd already looked up oversized shoes and ritualistic symbolism. And actually, I found something really strange, that these 2 things do actually have a meaning together. The ritualistic nature of oversized footwear can be symbolic and varies depending on culture, religious, or historical context. Many rituals involving oversized shoes focus on removal, such as taking them off when entering a holy place. However, it can have different meanings for cultures or religions, such as in religious contexts. This can be interpreted as following in the spiritual footsteps of a prophet or deity. In some cultures, oversized or specialized footwear was a symbol of authority. In European folklore, mythical oversized footwear like the 7 Leagues boot allowed the wearer to take impossibly large strides. These items were often used by protagonists to complete quests. Lastly, oversized shoes could represent the transcendent from one stage of existence to the next, or a person's journey into the afterlife. Considering it's a dead body that these oversized shoes were on, interesting that it's talking about the afterlife. And this was just my own research and probably has nothing to do with this case, but I found it kind of intriguing. On Raymond Richardson's body, an ID was found, but not the name of Richardson. It was actually the ID of another boy that was referred to as a street kid. This boy was still alive, and the investigators would not tell who the ID belonged to, so they haven't released the identity of the boy that was still alive. That's ID was on this boy. Just really weird. Was the killer trying to throw off the investigators by saying he was a different boy than he was? What I understand about Richardson is he wasn't a street boy like the other boys. Why did he pick this victim? Why did he actually use someone else's card or ID on this victim? Dennis Dewey's body did not have any form of ID. Nothing. Which is why it took them so long to identify him. All 3 boys were hogtied in a similar fashion. So at that time, it's thought to be a work of a serial killer. Whoever tied these boys was an expert at knot tying. In my mind, this kind of linked back to the Boy Scouts. Boy Scouts are taught how to tie all kinds of knots.
Well, I said the only thing I ever learned from Boy Scouts is a tourniquet knot.
People threaten my son, and right now he is crying over this scene, and I'm very upset about it. Myself, I think they should be punished.
Stanley Burkhart knew all the Boy Scout leaders in Troop 137. And he also knew the janitor and priest, Carr, who molested Richard Winman. Wasn't even going to add that he was also molested by this priest, but I was like, I have to add it after I talked about the shoes and afterlife. It's tied back to a priest. Also, if you remember on Tennessee, the Tennessee farm, that was a priest as well.
And Burkhart also knew the Jesuit. You know, I played basketball in the back of Jesuit, and there was Burkhart and Peter Modica on the sidelines. So they knew each other.
Winman, 12 years old at the time, wasn't a Jesuit high school student, but he says school janitor Peter Modica brought him on campus often. One day, Modica started raping him, and then priest and theology teacher Cornelius Carr walked in.
Then I thought it was over. It's a priest. It's a priest. He's a janitor. I can't tell you I thought it was over, and man, when he walked over to me, while Pete Modica was sodomizing me, and put his hand on my back and started masturbating, telling me to relax, I was just destroyed. I was destroyed.
I'm not sure if the Rope murders or Eddie Wells' death will ever be solved, but these deaths all lead to the involvement of a child sex ring. They lead to a long rabbit hole of a child sex ring, and I know this is just a small sample of the individuals that were involved in that ring. Even though it looks a lot like Stanley Burkhart did the murder, he's never been arrested for murder of the Eddie Wells or the Rope murders because they actually can't prove who did this. Hope one day these boys do get justice though. But the way they messed up the crime scenes and no DNA was taken because they had no way to test it back then makes me think that whoever did this will forever get away with it. That's just sad. Well, I love y'all and I thank you for joining me at the Murder She Should. I have been here long enough and I'm burning up. I'm going to let y'all say bye to my dogs and then we're going to end this video. Say bye. We love you. We'll see you next time at the Murder She Should as they make as much noise as they can. I love y'all.
There's monsters here in human form. They abuse their trust. swallow his whole, then regurgitate ashes to feed their lust. Monsters say they love us, but monsters